Every morning you pour vegetable oil into the pan. You have been doing it for 30 years because someone told you it was the heart-healthy choice. What nobody told you is what happens inside that pan when the oil gets hot. And what nobody told you is what you threw away when you stopped using what your grandmother cooked with. The fat you were told was killing you was not the problem. The fat you replaced it with was. Today I am going to show you the biochemistry behind that statement. Not opinion, not trend, not a contrarian take. The actual molecular chemistry of what happens to cooking fat under heat and why the switch an entire generation made in the 1980s may have been one of the most consequential nutritional mistakes in modern history. Stay with me because the section on heat stability is the one that changes how you think about every meal you cook from this point forward. I'm Dr. Jake Taylor. Before we go further, have you been avoiding animal fat for more than 10 years specifically because you were told it was dangerous for your heart? Type yes in the comments. I want to see how many people in this community made that same switch. What happened to lard is one of the most instructive stories in the history of nutrition science. For centuries, it was simply food. Your grandmother's generation fried in it, baked with it, used it as a matter of course. Nobody called it a health food. Nobody called it dangerous. It was just how cooking worked. Then, in the mid-20th century, a hypothesis emerged that changed everything. Dietary fat raises cholesterol. Cholesterol blocks arteries. Blocked arteries cause heart attacks. Therefore, animal fat is the primary cardiovascular enemy. The hypothesis was compelling. It was logical. It was promoted with considerable force by influential researchers and eventually by public health institutions worldwide. And an entire generation obeyed. They threw away the lard. They bought bottles of sunflower oil, soybean oil, canola oil. They ate margarine instead of butter. They chose low-fat everything. Here is what happened next. Heart attacks did not decrease. Obesity became an epidemic. Type 2 diabetes rates climbed in every decade that followed. The diseases the dietary revolution was supposed to prevent became more prevalent after the dietary revolution than before it. The question nobody wanted to ask for 40 years was the obvious one. What if the advice was wrong? And here is something that makes that question even more uncomfortable. The research that underpinned the anti-fat campaign was later found to have significant methodological problems. Key studies that contradicted the saturated fat hypothesis were suppressed or went unpublished for decades. The sugar industry, which had the most to gain from dietary attention shifting toward fat and away from sugar, funded research in the 1960s that shaped nutritional policy for a generation. The full picture of how that policy was made is not flattering to the institutions that promoted it, but that is a story for another video. What matters today is what the complete body of evidence now shows. Subscribe right now if you have been following nutritional advice for decades and still watching your health markers move in the wrong direction. This is exactly the kind of information we share every week. 3 seconds. Subscribe and let's continue. Let me start with something that will surprise most people. Lard is not primarily a saturated fat. That is the foundational myth that made the entire campaign against it possible. The actual composition of lard is approximately 48% monounsaturated fat. That is the same oleic acid that makes olive oil cardioprotective. The same fatty acid that makes the Mediterranean diet the most celebrated dietary pattern in cardiovascular medicine. Nearly half of lard's fat content is chemically identical to the fat we celebrate in extra virgin olive oil. Approximately 40% is saturated fat. The remaining 12% is polyunsaturated. This is a composition that closely mirrors what the human metabolic system evolved to process efficiently over hundreds of thousands of years. But there is one fatty acid in lard that separates it from virtually every other cooking fat available: arachidonic acid. a polyunsaturated omega-6 fatty acid that plays fundamental roles in human biology. It is a structural component of the membrane of every neuron in your brain. It participates in cardiac muscle function. It activates the immune response when pathogens enter the body. Arachidonic acid is essentially absent from vegetable oils. You can consume sunflower oil every day for a year and receive none. Lard contains it in meaningful quantities. When the generation that abandoned lard shifted entirely to vegetable oils, they removed this compound from their daily diet without anyone noting the significance of that removal. Margaret was 69 and had been experiencing persistent cognitive fatigue that her physician had attributed to aging. When I reviewed her dietary history, she had avoided all animal fat for 27 years. Her brain, which requires arachidonic acid as a structural component of neuronal membranes, had been receiving none of this compound from dietary sources for nearly 3 decades. The body can synthesize some arachidonic acid from other omega-6 fatty acids, but the conversion rate is limited and declines with age. Dietary sources matter increasingly after 60. When Margaret reintroduced appropriate quantities of lard alongside other animal fat sources, she reported measurable improvement in mental clarity within 8 weeks. I cannot prove causation from a single patient's experience, but the biochemical mechanism is documented, and her response was consistent with what that mechanism would predict. There is a second nutritional gap created by abandoning lard that almost nobody discusses. Vitamin D deficiency now affects an estimated 40 to 60% of adults over 50. It develops silently. Without adequate vitamin D, calcium cannot be absorbed regardless of how much you consume. Bone density declines despite supplementation. Immune function weakens. Mood deteriorates seasonally. Where do people look for vitamin D? Fish, eggs, fortified milk. What they rarely consider is that lard from pigs raised outdoors in sunlight can contain 500 to 1,000 international units of vitamin D per tablespoon. For comparison, a tablespoon of butter provides approximately 9 units. A tablespoon of olive oil provides 0. The lard that was thrown away in the 1980s was, for many people, one of their primary dietary sources of vitamin D. That source was eliminated with no acknowledgement of what was being removed alongside the fat. Lard also contains fat-soluble vitamins A and E, and selenium, a trace mineral essential for thyroid function. The thyroid regulates metabolic rate in every cell of the body. Selenium deficiency impairs thyroid hormone production directly. George was 71 and had been supplementing vitamin D for 4 years on his physician's recommendation after a deficiency was detected. His levels improved but never reached optimal. When I reviewed his diet, he had been avoiding all animal fats for decades and was consuming essentially no food sources of vitamin D beyond his supplement. We reintroduced appropriate quantities of lard from outdoor raised pigs alongside his supplement. His vitamin D levels reached optimal range for the first time at his 6-month blood test. His physician noted the change and asked what had shifted. George's answer was simply, "I stopped throwing away the food that contained what I was supplementing for." Now, the cholesterol question, because this is where most people stop listening, and I need you to stay with me for a moment. The hypothesis that dietary saturated fat raises blood cholesterol and that elevated blood cholesterol directly causes heart attacks was never definitively proven in large-scale randomized clinical trials. That is not a fringe position. That is the conclusion of some of the largest systematic reviews of cardiovascular nutrition research ever conducted. One meta-analysis pooling data from nearly 350,000 people followed for up to 23 years found no significant association between saturated fat consumption and risk of coronary heart disease, stroke, or cardiovascular mortality. The relative risk was effectively 1. No statistical association. Another large meta-analysis examining 9 randomized controlled trials with over 13,000 participants concluded that restriction of saturated fat cannot be recommended for prevention of cardiovascular disease or mortality. These are not blog posts. These are published analyses of randomized controlled trials, the highest standard of evidence-based medicine, and they say that the nutritional recommendation that reshaped the diet of an entire generation was not supported by the data. This does not mean lard is unlimited health food. We will get to the real contraindications shortly, but it means the premise on which the entire anti-animal fat campaign was built was weaker than the public was ever told. There is one more piece of the cholesterol story that is almost never mentioned in popular discussions of this topic. The liver produces between 700 and 1,000 milligrams of cholesterol per day on its own. When you consume dietary cholesterol, the liver responds by reducing its own production. The system self-regulates. For most people, dietary cholesterol has minimal effect on blood cholesterol levels because the liver compensates automatically. This is why the most recent dietary guidelines removed the upper limit on dietary cholesterol intake entirely. It no longer exists as a regulated nutrient in the guidelines. The scientific basis for restricting it was not sufficient to maintain the recommendation. And yet the cultural memory of cholesterol fear remains decades after the nutritional science moved on. What actually does raise LDL cholesterol in a majority of people? Refined carbohydrates, white bread, sugar, pastries, sweetened beverages. These drive triglyceride production in the liver and increase small, dense LDL particles, the type most associated with cardiovascular risk. The foods that replaced animal fat in the 1980s diet, low-fat products compensating with sugar and refined starch, were doing more damage to lipid profiles than the lard they replaced. The irony is almost architectural in its completeness. Now, let me tell you about heat, because this is the most practically important thing in today's video and the part that should change what you do in your kitchen immediately. Every cooking fat has a smoke point, the temperature at which it begins to break down, smoke, and release compounds that should not be in food. When oil reaches its smoke point, it undergoes chemical reactions that produce free radicals, aldehydes, acrolein, and in some cases trans fats. These are not abstract concerns. These are documented carcinogenic and inflammatory compounds formed through the chemistry of oxidized fat. Refined sunflower oil has a smoke point of approximately 160 degrees Celsius in its unrefined form. Butter begins breaking down around 150 degrees. Lard begins smoking at approximately 190 degrees. Now consider what temperature your pan reaches when you fry eggs, potatoes, or any protein. In a standard home kitchen, you are typically working between 180 and 220 degrees Celsius. This means that unrefined vegetable oil reaches its smoke point and begins producing toxic compounds in virtually every pan in every kitchen in which it is used for everyday cooking. The slight haze, the familiar smell, the appearance of normalcy, none of these signals the chemical combustion that is occurring. The oxidation products go directly into the food and then directly into the person eating it. Lard, with its high proportion of monounsaturated and saturated fats, is one of the most thermally stable cooking fats available. It oxidizes more slowly, it degrades less at cooking temperatures, it generates substantially fewer toxic oxidation products than most vegetable oils under the same conditions. The paradox this creates is worth stating explicitly. The product that was declared the enemy of heart health behaves more safely under cooking conditions than the product that replaced it. An entire generation threw away the thermally stable fat and replaced it with the thermally unstable one. The switch that was made in the name of cardiovascular protection was, from a heat chemistry perspective, a move in the wrong direction. William was 74 and had been a careful, health-conscious cook his entire adult life. He had used sunflower oil exclusively for 30 years. When I explained the smoke point chemistry in detail, and he understood what had been happening in his pan at every meal, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "I can see the haze sometimes. I always assumed it was just steam. That haze is not steam. It is the visual evidence of the oxidation chemistry that produces the compounds the research has connected to chronic inflammation and cellular damage. The smell of oil beginning to smoke is the smell of a chemical reaction you do not want in your food." He switched his high-heat cooking to lard immediately. His inflammatory markers at 3 months were measurably lower than they had been at any point in the preceding 5 years of blood tests. Let me tell you about James. He was 68 and had been cooking exclusively with sunflower oil for 30 years on his cardiologist's recommendation. His inflammatory markers had been elevated for years, despite a diet his physician described as heart healthy. When I walked him through the heat chemistry and the oxidation research, he looked genuinely troubled. He said, "I switched specifically to protect my heart. You are telling me the oil I switched to may have been contributing to the inflammation my cardiologist has been trying to reduce? That is precisely what the oxidation chemistry suggests." At his 6-month follow-up after switching his cooking fat, his C-reactive protein had dropped by 28%. His cardiologist asked what had changed. The answer surprised her. Before I give you the complete practical framework for using lard correctly, I want to stop for a moment. If this is connecting something you have wondered about for years, please share this video right now with someone who has been avoiding animal fat for decades and still struggling with their health markers. That conversation might be the most useful nutritional discussion they have this year. Now, the real contraindications. Because lard is not appropriate for everyone, and I will not pretend otherwise. If you have gallstones, any dietary fat, including lard, stimulates gallbladder contraction. If a stone is displaced, the resulting biliary colic is one of the most severe pains a person can experience. If a stone becomes lodged in the bile duct, emergency surgery follows. Manage all fats carefully if you have this condition. If you have diagnosed non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which affects approximately 1 in 3 adults over 50, excess fat of any type worsens the condition. Total fat intake requires monitoring, not just lard specifically. If you have chronic pancreatitis, a compromised pancreas cannot digest large amounts of fat. Lard represents a direct path to exacerbation in this situation. If you have experienced a heart attack or stroke, the cardiovascular risk calculation changes. While the general population data does not support restricting saturated fat, people with established cardiovascular disease represent a subset where replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat has shown some benefit in reducing repeat events. Discuss any dietary fat changes with your cardiologist before implementing them. And if your LDL cholesterol is persistently elevated despite a relatively clean diet, you may belong to the approximately 15 to 25% of people with genetic hypersensitivity to dietary cholesterol, where the liver does not reduce its own production when dietary cholesterol increases. A complete lipid panel will give you the information you need to know which group you are in. For the 75 to 80% of people without these contraindications, the practical framework is straightforward. For high heat cooking, frying, sautéing, roasting at temperatures above 180 degrees Celsius, lard is one of the most appropriate fats available. It is thermally stable, produces minimal oxidation compounds, and has a flavor profile that complements most savory cooking. For cold applications, dressings, finishing, and low-heat cooking, extra virgin olive oil remains the best choice. Its polyphenol content and oleocanthal anti-inflammatory compounds are most bioavailable when not subjected to high heat. Use each fat for what its chemistry is suited to. Patricia was 73 and came to my practice specifically to discuss the lard question after watching conflicting information online. She had gallstones and wanted to know whether she could use any animal fat at all. This is a case where the answer is genuinely no. Any fat, including lard, stimulates gallbladder contraction. With stones present, that contraction risks displacement. Her situation is real and the contraindication is absolute for her. She was disappointed but appreciated the clarity. I told her, for your specific situation, the contraindication is real and the risk is not theoretical. For the majority of people without gallstones or the other conditions I have described, the biochemical story is very different. Her case illustrates why this is not a universal recommendation. It is an evidence-based position that requires individual assessment. The appropriate daily amount for a healthy adult with normal body weight is 20 to 30 grams, approximately 1 tablespoon. For someone who is sedentary or carrying excess weight, 10 to 15 grams is the appropriate range, and this is in addition to, not instead of, accounting for other fat sources in your daily diet. What you should not do is heat lard to the point of browning or smoking. At temperatures above 200 degrees, the same oxidation chemistry that damages vegetable oils begins to affect lard as well. The goal is cooking at appropriate temperatures, not scorching fat of any type. Also, never reuse cooking fat. Each reheating cycle dramatically increases the concentration of oxidation products from the previous cooking session. Use it once. The best source of lard is from pigs raised outdoors with access to sunlight. This is where the vitamin D content is highest and the fatty acid profile is most favorable. Indoor raised commercial lard has a lower vitamin D content and a slightly different omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. If you can access pasture-raised lard, the nutritional difference is meaningful. If not, standard lard from a reliable source is still preferable to refined vegetable oil for high-heat cooking purposes. Dorothy was 72 and had been told by her physician that her diet was excellent, but her inflammatory markers remained stubbornly elevated. When I reviewed her actual cooking practices, she was using sunflower oil at high heat daily and had been for 25 years of careful, conscientious, heart-healthy cooking. We shifted her high-heat cooking to lard in appropriate quantities. She kept her olive oil for dressings and low-heat applications where it is genuinely beneficial. At 4 months, her inflammatory markers had improved to a level her physician described as the best they had been in a decade. She said, "I spent 25 years thinking I was being careful. I was being careful with the wrong information." The broader lesson here is one that applies to nutrition more widely. For decades, people were given a simplified framework: animal fat bad, vegetable oil good. The actual biochemistry is more nuanced. The thermal stability of a fat matters. The specific fatty acid composition matters. The presence or absence of fat-soluble nutrients matters. Whether a fat is consumed raw or heated matters enormously. Your grandmother did not use lard because she was ignorant of nutrition. She used it because it worked. Because food cooked in thermally stable fat tasted good, sustained people through physical work, and did not produce the epidemic of inflammatory disease that followed the generation that replaced it. The science did not vindicate vegetable oil over animal fat. The science, 40 years later, came back to a more nuanced position that is considerably closer to what the pre-industrial kitchen already knew. Helen was 66 and had raised 3 children on what she described as meticulously healthy cooking: olive oil for everything cold, sunflower oil for everything hot, no butter, no lard, no animal fat of any kind for over 30 years. She was proud of this. When she came to my practice, her inflammatory markers were elevated and her vitamin D was chronically low despite moderate sun exposure and a good diet. When I connected the absence of animal fat from her diet to both of those findings, she was resistant at first. "This contradicts everything I was taught," she said. "I understand that," I told her. "The teaching was based on a hypothesis that the full body of evidence does not support." At 5 months after reintroducing appropriate quantities of lard for high-heat cooking alongside maintaining her olive oil for cold applications, her inflammatory markers had normalized and her vitamin D had risen without any change in her supplementation. She told me, 30 years of careful cooking and I was missing 2 things the food I avoided contained. That is a hard thing to accept, but it is a useful thing to know. Tell me in the comments, what cooking fat are you currently using most often? And did you switch away from animal fat at some point specifically because of health advice you received? I read every comment and your answers help me understand what this community is navigating. One more thing worth saying. Medicine is not a religion. There are no absolute sins and no absolute virtues in nutrition. There is a specific body in a specific state of health with specific metabolic needs and a specific dose of a specific food. The right answer is built from those variables, not from a campaign, not from a hypothesis that was promoted before the full evidence was gathered. Your grandmother's cooking wisdom was not scientifically naive. It was the accumulated observation of centuries. The science took 40 years to circle back to something she already knew. Everything in its measure, the right fat for the right application, no extremes in either direction, and the courage to question advice you followed faithfully for decades when the evidence no longer supports it. If today's video gave you something that shifts how you think about what you cook with, share it with someone who has been faithfully using vegetable oil for decades in the name of heart health. Someone who sees the haze in their pan and assumes it is harmless. Someone who threw away their grandmother's lard 30 years ago and has never questioned whether that was the right decision. That conversation could genuinely change one of the most repeated daily decisions in their life, and it costs nothing to have it. I'm Dr. Jake Taylor. Subscribe if you have not already. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.